Will the Bengals take a defensive lineman with the 28th overall pick in the 2023 NFL draft? Let's break down who they could take at 28 defensive line-wise and so much more as we look at the big men in the defensive trenches with Joe Goodberry. Hi again, everyone, and welcome in to CBT. I'm James Rapien of allbengals.com, joined by Joe Goodberry. Make sure you're following him on Twitter at Joe Goodberry. Must follow all the time, but certainly during draft season. And let's dive right on into this defensive line class and specifically what the Bengals could do at 28. But let's start at the top of it. When you finished your rankings, and I'm grouping defensive line together, but who's at the top, on the edge? Who's at the top of those defensive tackle rankings?
Well, on the edge, it's going to be Will Anderson. I think he's a lock to go top 6 or so, depending on how the quarterbacks shake out. And when the first non-quarterback off the board, it's probably going to be him. I think he compares probably favorably to Khalil Mack coming out of Buffalo. So should go in that range. Defensive tackle, it comes out as Calijah Kancey, and that's ahead of Jalen Carter. And Carter didn't do all the testing and things like that, so it hurt his profile. Carter still is, when he's on and based on tape, the highest graded defensive tackle in this class. We are, as a collective here, going to struggle to find out where he's going to land on draft day. But the guys that could be there, that we're talking about for the Bengals, Kancey is in that. If he does grade very high, he's highly productive. He tested like a freak athlete. His tape's really good. So, again, there's got to be a negative there of why we wouldn't want him, but there's going to be a bunch of defensive ends too. I think it's a poor D tackle class as an overall picture. I think it's a really good defensive end class, but I think the Bengals may need D tackle more than D end.
And that's the part of it here where I see some different edge rushers potentially at 28. Knowing the Bengals' history, and the last time they took a defensive lineman round 1 was Justin Smith. The last time you take a true interior defensive lineman where you're just inside all the time would be Dan Big Daddy Wilkinson, unless I'm missing someone. So it's been a while. Where do you think – what are some guys that if they're there at 28 – Calijah Kancey we've talked about, but they're there at 28, you're like, all right, I think the Bengals, knowing what they've done, where they've gotten these mid-round guys and they've nailed them, would seriously consider making that pick.
Right, because I agree with you. I think they would rather wait to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round. That's where you got Carlos Dunlap, Geno Atkins. I mean, 2 guys that'll probably be on the Ring of Honor one day. I would include David Pollock as a first rounder. He was after, kind of linebacker at the time, but we knew what the league was transitioning to now. They called him a linebacker. We know he would have been an edge defender, edge rusher, right? So I would say he's the last one. But point being is, who could be there for them that could make them consider it? I think the one guy that potentially could be there is Myles Murphy out of Clemson. They had a top 30 visit with him, and actually Marion Hobby did the defensive line drills at Clemson also for the pro day, so he got to see him up close and personal. I think he knows him anyways. But I think Murphy originally was talked about as a top 15 pick, has started to slide a little bit. His tape is just okay. He doesn't have a lot of go-to moves. He really will just use the long arm, both in the run defense and as a pass rusher. Tested very well, but his production is hit or miss. It really puts him in the 65th percentile. Most of his pass rush win rate numbers are near the bottom of this class. He looks like he doesn't know what he's doing a lot of times out there, but that's why he's not a top 15 pick. I'm not really selling him because I don't love him at 28 either. I think he could continue to slide. Other guys that have, one guy that's been compared to Trey Hendrickson, and maybe that means they would love him a lot, is Lucas Van Ness out of Iowa. And I think he could be there. I think originally coming in the draft season, he was expected to be in the 20s, maybe even on the back half of the 20s. And then he tested really, really well. And I don't know that everyone expected that because he looks like a power rusher in the same vein of a Trey Hendrickson, but like Hendrickson, has elite athletic attributes. So I think Van Ness still ends up going before the Bengals pick, but those would be the guys that I think that they would at least consider and wonder. I think there's some emergency guys in case the board falls the way they don't expect it, and that could be Isaiah Foskey, Will McDonald, or maybe Felix and Eduke Uzama. And I think all those guys are probably more likely in the 32 to 45 range of the draft. But again, we talked about scenarios where it could happen.
Real quick on defensive tackle, just Calijah Kancey is the only fly in the ointment, arm length and in size to a degree. And are there any other defensive tackles that you think are worth mentioning at 28?
It is the big issue. There's more than that. So we'll start with the size. Basically, the smallest defensive tackle you'll find, right? Puts him in the 0th percentile for all of these things. And when you look at his frame, and scouts and coaches and GMs are going to do this, and they're going to say, okay, Emmanuel Forbes, you're in the 1 percentile for your weight, but you're also almost 6'1" with a wingspan of 6'7". You look like you can add the frame or add weight to your frame and carry it no problem. When you look at Calijah Kancey, you see slim shoulders, you see a slim waist, he doesn't really have junk in the trunk, if you will, and you wonder, can he actually pack it on? Does he have the frame to put it on? He really doesn't look like it. He looks like he probably should have been playing defensive end his whole life, with the way he's built. Having said that, I do think he's dynamic enough, quick enough, explosive enough to overcome those issues. So it's not like he didn't play with like this in college. He played with these issues in college and still dominated in a lot of his tapes. I mean, absolutely dominated and was tough to block. I will also say, I think Pitt's scheme is really good defensively. They run a lot of quarters, they make you hold the ball, and they do a lot of stunts up front to free their guys up so where he's not dealing with, close combat with his shorter arms. All helps Kancey. And I think if you're going to draft him, you're going to do the same things and say, hey, we're going to try and move you around, try and put you in space, loop you and Sam Hubbard together and cause some chaos. Sounds great. So, everyone's got their issues. And I think some teams will look at him and try to find the value because if he was big enough, he's a top 5 lock. He's not big enough. So if you can get him at 28, I think it's value at that point. And the other guys I would mention are Tommy Adebawore out of Northwestern and Bryan Bresee out of Clemson. I think both are on the cusp of could be considered at 28. Adebawore, I want to say, is 14th on Mel Kiper's big board now. So don't be surprised if he's actually the pick. Tests and scores really well for us. It's going to be a top 10 player on my board. So it would make sense to be a very similar to a Dax Hill situation where we didn't talk about it enough, but he checks every single box. So it makes sense. And then Bresee is the guy who, had he have finished the rest of his career the way he played as a freshman, he would be a top 15 pick. He wasn't able to do that. He had a lot of circumstances around himself outside of football too, but that makes it a risk because you didn't get to see it the last 2 years of what he showed as a freshman. I think he's more likely to go in the back half of round 1 after 28 and maybe in the first part of round 2.
Let's look at some day 2 guys, and they love day 2 defensive linemen. Sam Hubbard would be the most recent one, but you mentioned a couple of them, but Michael Johnson is another one. Round 2, round 3, that's like their sweet spot, it feels like, to add guys of that at that spot, at that position, and they've had a lot of success doing it. Who could they potentially draft at pick 60 or at pick 92 in that defensive line room?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple of defensive ends that could be potentially go in the top of round 2. Guys like Isaiah Foskey out of Notre Dame. I think there's a chance he could still be there at 60. Sometimes these guys get mixed around. He reminds me of Sam Hubbard, number 1. And I had Sam Hubbard as a fringe first round guy. Same with Joseph Asai, who they got in the 3rd round, right? These are guys that graded as fringe first rounders, and Foskey's one of them. Derek Hall out of Auburn is another. And then I mentioned FAU, Felix Uzama could fit that mold as well, Will McDonald. So I do think in round 2, there could be, because it's such a strong class, guys are going to get pushed down maybe a little bit further because it's so strong that you could see the value. You get there at that pick, and Derek Hall from Auburn's still there. And they're like, how do we deny it? We see him as a top 35, 40 guy, so they'll make the pick. And then at defensive tackle, I do think there's a chance for that to be the pick at 60. I know they spent a 3rd round pick last year on Zach Carter. He didn't look explosive enough as a rookie, and he's a former defensive end, so I didn't expect him to be good versus the run. I thought he got better there as the season went on, but man, I could probably count on one hand how many times he won as a pass rusher last year. So they probably would like to add some juice, and if that's not in the first round with Kancey or Adebawore or even Bresee, I think in round 2, you could be looking at guys like Gervon Dexter out of Florida. They met with him at the Combine. Maybe it's Zach Pickens. Maybe it's Jalen Redmond in the 5th, 4th round or so. Maybe Mazi Smith is still there in the 2nd round out of Michigan. The guy I wanted to talk about, though, is one of the guys we watched in the first episode of Bengals on the Brain when we started with the draft, and that's Wisconsin's Keanu Benton, who had a really good Senior Bowl. He's a stockier, shorter guy, and I think he looks to me like B.J. Hill, very similar to B.J. Hill, where he can defend the run, be a nose tackle, sort of guy, but then also kick out and rush from the B gap and from the 3 tech. Wisconsin moved him around a lot and let him do all of those things. He was highly productive and tested well. I think he could be the pick at 60.
Are there any day 3 sleepers, guys that you really like under the radar that the Bengals could target in the 100s, whether it's 4th round at 136, 5th, 6th, 7th round, that could potentially or should be on Bengals fans' radar?
Yeah, there is, and that's why I wanted to throw Jalen Redmond in there at Oklahoma just previously. I thought he's probably a day 3 guy. Tested very well, played as a nose tackle. I think he's a 3 tech all the way. That conference, that team, they play with 3 defensive linemen, so you almost never get to see him rush without being double teamed, right? But when he does get his chances, his pass rush win rate on true pass sets very high, and you see it on tape. You only get like 2 or 3 of them a game, and you're like, "Whoo, he beats that guy every time." I would love a Jalen Redmond in the 4th, 5th, maybe even he's even there later. And then you got like the guy they've met with, Desjuan Johnson, who out of Toledo, who maybe they saw him originally when they took Tyson Anderson, but maybe a top 3 or 4 first step in the class. Like we're talking penetrator type that really causes chaos, and he's expected to go in the 5th round or so. Maybe he gets pushed up to the 4th round. But a couple other guys that I should mention, and I think could be in that range. Tuli Lopu. Let me say that again for
Tuli
you.
Tuipulotu.
Jeez, thank you for saving me because
Tuipulotu.
I almost fumbled that completely, or did I? But
come on, Jeremy Hill.
I know, short arms, right? And he he thought he was a defensive tackle at USC because he played a lot of defensive tackle, but he weighed in as a defensive end. And Lou Anarumo was actually at the USC Pro Day as well. And I think that he could be a guy that you see as a chess piece, inside, outside guy. I don't know if he goes in round 2. He might go in round 3. I think that's somebody they could look at and make that pick. But I wonder at defensive end, it's a strong class, right? I said that. There's going to be chances to take guys in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, maybe even later. And it's kind of similar to last year, how they get Jeffrey Gunter, who I thought was like a 4th rounder. They get him in the 7th round. So if they still value him as a similar way I do, once you get to a certain point, are you going to make a pick at a defensive end that's probably the same type of prospect as a Jeffrey Gunter and say, you know what, this is when we double up at tight end. This is when we double up at running back instead, because we like the guys probably 6 deep now at edge rusher.
And yeah, I think that's a very good point, because at some point you say, all right, well, we already have that and we're already working and we've already put time in with this guy. And yeah, he's high on our board, but this tight end is close and we could add some juice to that room or add another body to that room. Or as we mentioned in our running back video, the idea of dual backs in this draft makes a ton of sense. Anything else on defensive linemen before we get out of here?
They're going to need to add somebody at some point, but it's a strong class, and maybe that guy doesn't play a lot as a rookie, which is unless you're spending a first 2, maybe even 3 round pick, they should probably still add one. It doesn't mean he's going to make a big impact as a rookie. I think that's some of the things that fans, when they do these mock drafts, they're like, all right, give me all the guys that'll play this year. It's not really realistic. I could see D-line, because you're going to lose, or potentially could lose, DJ Reader next year. You could potentially lose Trey Hendrickson in 2 years. They should start looking to replenish that, and I could see that being mid-round to day 3 picks.
Make sure you follow Joe on Twitter at Joe Goodberry. Check out Bengals on the Brain. Like he mentioned, there's been a ton of draft breakdowns. He's jumped into the tape, showed you the film, so make sure you check out all of his shows right here on Cincinnati Bengals Talk. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell. And for our channel coordinator, Andrew Fox Miller, I'm James Rapien. Thank you so much for watching right here on Cincinnati Bengals Talk.